I have a principle that governs my preaching. If I'm ever going to tell a story about someone in the church, I always give that person a heads up. I will call that person, email that person, somehow let that person know that I am going to talk about them in my sermon. Clearly, Andy Lashley does not share that same principle. I had no idea that I was about to see that wonderful image of my face on the screen. If you get the church emails, that's actually from a church email a week ago that Andy sent out. The pictures from a staff brainstorming session. Andy actually encouraged as many of you that wanted to save that horrific picture on the background of your phone, and at least one of you did that last week, and you showed it to me. I'm not going to name who that person was. Well, good morning. Glad you're here with us this morning. Happy Super Bowl Sunday. Let's do a quick poll here. We got Eagles, Patriots, and I don't care. Okay, Eagle fans, who's going for the Eagles? Okay, who's going for the Patriots? Who doesn't care? Okay, wow. There's a lot of people that don't care. All right, I was just wanting to know. So I'm going to get into this next sermon in this series in just a minute. But let me first of all say a big thank you. So many of you turned in your pledge cards this past week for our Imagine campaign, and so we're really thankful for your generous hearts. There's quite a few of you that told us you wanted to turn in your cards today, and so we don't have the total yet. We'll give that to you next week, but we just wanted you to know how thankful we are for you and your generosity and for getting those pledge cards in. If you still want to, you're welcome to. You can do that today. You can do that this week. You're welcome to email Tammy. But we're really excited about all the things that we're going to start doing with this money. And if you remember, if you were here a few weeks ago, we're hoping to do things like increase our foster care program. We're hoping to do things like build a ministry that would help our ladies as they get out of prison to get jobs and to acclimate back into society. And there's a lot of other programs we're wanting to start. But we're really excited, and so thank you for turning your pledge cards in this past week. The series we're in is called The Mission of God, and we're focusing on the good deeds portion, which is the service portion of the mission of God. And I'm in a season of learning within this series, and so I'm reading a lot. A few weeks ago, I went down to Oklahoma City and visited with one of my friends who lives in an intentional living community downtown. And the place that he lives is actually right across the street from the City Rescue Mission. And so he gets to observe a lot of things that happen when it comes to poverty. And one of the stories he told me was kind of interesting, kind of made me pause. The place where he lives, the refuge, shares a dumpster with the City Rescue Mission. And so he says pretty often what happens is he'll go outside and observe, and these vehicles from suburbs will pull up to the City Rescue Mission, and these wonderful people will get out of their cars with boxes of blankets and shoes and give these items to the homeless. And then, but 15, 20 minutes later, my friend will watch the homeless people walk out the back door of the refuge and dump the blankets and the shoes in the dumpster. You see, even if we want to help the poor, it doesn't necessarily mean that the way we want to help is actually what they need. And so he told me that story, and man, it just got me thinking, how do we really help the poor? And so if you want to write this down, having a heart for the poor is good, but having a plan for the poor is better. In some ways, this series is trying to make two moves. The first move is, I think it's really helpful for us to go from doing nothing to doing something. And that's why a lot of the first messages in this series with surveying poverty in Scripture, and then the second week really going over Matthew 25, we ought to be doing something. God cares about the least of these, and we should be doing something. Well, the second move from doing nothing to doing something is doing something to doing something smarter. And so that's where the series is going. And what this sermon today is, I'm just going to lay one piece out there in this very complicated puzzle. So this is not going to solve everything, but I think this is a piece that we have to have on the table. So if you have a Bible, I'm going to go to the Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 19. I'm going to look at one of these great stories from one of the Old Testament prophets. And to set a little bit of the context, we'll do some Bible trivia. Who was one of the most famous prophets in the Old Testament whose name starts with an E? Elijah, very good. 1 Kings chapter 18 is maybe the most iconic Elijah story, and it's the story where God takes Elijah onto a certain mountain. Does anybody know the mountain? What's the mountain? Starts with a C, Mount Carmel, and Elijah has this duel with prophets of a false god who would be Baal, and God gives victory to Elijah by sending something down from heaven, fire from heaven. Well, this story ends at the end of 1 Kings chapter 18. We'll pick up the story in verse 46. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. So this is the end of the story. He's just got through with the greatest victory of his life, and he gets up and he runs to Jezreel. Now, why would he run to Jezreel? Likely, the reason he's running to Jezreel is because he thinks that the next step in God's plan is God's actually going to overthrow the government. Jezreel at this time is the capital. This is where Ahab and Jezebel live. This is where Ahab off the throne somehow. Maybe they repent, maybe they resign, maybe the people revolt, but somehow God's going to do something in the capital. That's why Elijah's running there. Chapter 19, verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezreel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." So she's not intimidated. Often evil is not intimidated by good. Jezebel's still wanting to kill Elijah. Verse 3, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. So the Bible uses that word running twice. So first he's running towards the capital with great confidence. We're going to take over. But then he's running away from the capital in cowardice because he's scared of Jezebel. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. Now, Elijah doesn't have a servant because he's wealthy. Elijah has a servant because he's a prophet. And so for him to leave his servant behind, in essence, is him saying, I'm hanging it up. I'm done. So he's basically resigning from his job as a prophet. He comes to a broom bush. He sat down under it and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Then he laid down under the bush and fell asleep. So Elijah has just gone through the greatest victory of his life. Now he's entered into the greatest depression of his life. God's not making any sense. I mean, in Elijah's mind, God raised him up. God called him out. God said, "You go proclaim the message to my people." God gives him the most incredible victory you could possibly imagine. And then Jezebel still wants to kill him. And Elijah is going through great discouragement, which, kind of a side point here, discouragement's just part of life. The greatest men and the greatest women in the Bible endured seasons of great discouragement. Now, I want you to pay attention at what God does, because how God handles Elijah's despair shows so much about the wisdom of God. Here's what God does. Verse 5. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." So notice the angel doesn't say, "Fear not." The angel doesn't say, "Take off your sandals." The angel says, "I want you to eat something." And the angel reaches out his hand and touches Elijah. Elijah looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then he laid down again. Now, this is such an interesting part of the story, because think about it in other parts of the Bible. Think about what angels do. You got, book of Daniel, you got angels coming down and shutting the mouths of lions. Also in the book of Daniel, you have angels going toe-to-toe with spiritual forces, protecting the people of God against these awful, evil beings. In Luke 1, you have an angel declaring this breathtaking news to the world that Jesus Christ is going to be born. So all throughout the Bible, you have these incredible moments where angels do these huge things on behalf of God. Think about the 10 plagues. Angel comes in at the end to deliver the judgment of God. So angels usually do really, really important things in the name of God. What does this angel do? He makes Elijah a sandwich. Like, I'd love to have witnessed that conversation in heaven as angels are talking about what they did in the given day, and this angel gets asked, what did you do today? Maybe he's thinking, I don't really want to talk about that. He gives Elijah a sandwich. Now, before we go off and say, well, that's not that important, think about the wisdom of God. God knows you better than you know you. And God knew Elijah better than Elijah knew Elijah. And what God was doing is taking care of his physical needs. So first thing you can write down this morning is, I am a physical being. Sometimes what happens when we go through problems and when we have really difficult things happen in our lives, we forsake that which is most fundamental, which is your body. You see, it's so easy when you get discouraged to assume it's a psychological problem and that you need a pill, or to assume that it's a relational problem and that you need a friend, or to assume that it's a spiritual problem and that you just need to pray a little bit more. Now, certainly those things are true. There are psychological problems, there's relational problems, there's spiritual problems, but you know what? There are some times where you need a really good Mexican meal with a sopapilla and then a nap. Like, you're a physical being. God made you that way. And there are some times where you just need to take care of yourself. Sometimes, not to get all weird on you, but sometimes you need a hug. Did you notice that the angel reached out his hand and he touched Elijah? Why would he do that? It's because God knows Elijah better than Elijah knows Elijah, and sometimes you need physical touch. My guess is for you grown-ups out there, you remember what it was like to be a kid. And kids, if you're listening, you know what this feels like when something's really bothering you. Maybe you have a bad day at school. Maybe a friend said something mean to you, but you can't really process how you're feeling. And so you come home and you're in a really bad mood, and you don't know what to say to your mom and dad. You don't know how to express it. But when your mom or your dad picks you up and holds you, it just feels right. I deal with this all the time with my daughters. They need physical touch. Well, when you grow up, it's not that changes. We need that. And God understands that you need that. So again, sometimes you just need food. Sometimes you need sleep. Sometimes you need physical touch. This is the wisdom of God. I heard Tim Keller give a great sermon years and years ago out of this text, and he made this really, really good point. He said, when we reduce our being to one dimension, we short-circuit the beauty of our complexity. That's a great thought. You are a multifaceted being, and you must be dealt with on a holistic level. Here's what happens next. Elijah eats, and then he gets up, and he actually travels for 40 days. So just imagine that. 40 days, out in the wilderness, out in the mountains, by yourself. Well, he travels to a mountain called Mount Horeb. Now, that mountain actually has another name in the Bible, Mount Sinai, which ironically, the mountain that Elijah is about to walk upon is the same mountain that Moses walked upon to get the 10 Commandments. The word of the Lord came to Elijah. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've put to death your prophets with the sword, and I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. What are you doing here, Elijah? When you imagine God asking that question in your mind, how is God asking it? Like, where is God's inflection? Have you ever gone to a different city and seen someone from work or church that you didn't expect to be there? I was in New York years and years ago, and I show up at church on a Sunday, and I look over, and there's Charles Gregg, guy that goes to this church, part of our heritage plant now, and I saw him, and what I said was, Charles, what are you doing here? Because when you say the question that way, what you mean is, I didn't expect you to be here. So when God sees Elijah in the cave, do you think that's how he's asking it? Huh, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Jezreel. No. God knows Elijah's already there. God is not asking this question because God needs information. God's asking this question because Elijah actually needs action. God's asking this question because Elijah actually needs to talk. God already knows. But God knows that Elijah needs to get some things off his chest. You see, you can write this down. You're a physical being, but you're also an emotional being. And God gets that because, again, God knows you better than you know yourself. God knows that you get sad. God knows that you get embarrassed. God knows that you get worried. And sometimes what we really need to do to be emotionally healthy is we actually need to get those things off of the inside into the ears of somebody else. I was, years ago, I heard Doug Manning do a talk. He's an expert on grief. And he had this great illustration, and I might have used this illustration before, but he says that going through life is like your emotions are like this bucket, and when things happen to you, it creates all sorts of emotions inside. So you get an email that really upsets you, and you're mad about that. Or you get a phone call and you get some news that's pretty alarming, and maybe you're shocked, or you're surprised, or you're worried. And then you have that argument with your mom, and so you have more emotions go into the bucket. And then you get that news about someone's sickness, and it just makes you really sad. And then you turn on the TV and you see something, and that makes you sad too. And so inside your bucket, you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of different emotions swimming around. And most of us, what we do to try to help each other is we come alongside people and we try to add information into their emotional bucket as if that's actually going to help. It's already full. And so what Manning is saying is that if you actually want to be healthy, the only way to do that is you have to start emptying some of it out. Well, that's what's happening in this story. Elijah's upset. He's afraid. He's scared. He had this plan. He was supposed to go do his thing. It didn't work out. And so now he's despairing even of life. Well, he's got to talk about it. And so God asks him, what are you doing here? Because God knows that Elijah has some things that he really needs to say. Guys, if I can talk to the men for just a minute, I'm not convinced that we're that great at this one. In fact, I'm going to offend every man in the room here. If you can put these people on the screen, these are great heroes and terrible examples because they're really good at acting in movies, but they're so bad at portraying what it really means to be a man, because what these guys illustrate is that it's okay to be this stoic, isolated island of a man, and that has nothing to do with the way the Bible tells us to be men of God. It's okay to talk to someone about what's going on in your life. In fact, if you don't talk to someone about what's going on in your life, you really can't be that healthy of an individual. In fact, if you want to think about manliness, think about Elijah. The guy just manhandled 450 prophets of Baal, and then he runs likely faster than a horse to get to Jezreel, and then he's in the mountains for 40 days by himself. Like, you can't get more manly than Elijah. And so how does he handle this? Elijah, what are you doing here? Oh, just hanging out in a cave, God, building a fire. Probably going to catch a cougar and eat it later. No, Elijah doesn't play the man card. I mean, if you really read the text, what Elijah's doing, he's talking about his feelings. Because Elijah's an emotional being, and so are you. You're an emotional being, and you have to take care of that part of yourself in order to be emotionally healthy. Here's what happens next. Verse 11, the Lord said, "Go out, stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." So again, everything I'm saying, I'm just inviting you to think about the wisdom of God. First, God gives Elijah food and touch. Then God listens to Elijah. But the last thing that God does is God invites Elijah to stand in the presence of the Lord. Again, God knows you better than you know you. And so one of the things that God understands about you is that you can't be whole unless you are connected to Him. So you can write this down. Yes, you're a physical being. Yes, you're an emotional being. You're also a spiritual being. You have part of your nature that is radically connected to this invisible God. And what's ironic is that our culture is actually starting to understand that. You've heard the phrase, "I'm spiritual but not religious." You know what that means. Our culture is skeptical of organized institutional religion, but our culture is very much embracing this idea that each of us have this part of ourselves that's very much connected to the divine. Businesses are learning that mindfulness training actually produces a great amount of longevity for their employees. Well, what's mindfulness? It's the same kind of thing as prayer or meditation. It's similar. Our culture is starting to understand, yes, we are spiritual beings. Well, we as Christians, we already know that. In fact, in the book of Ecclesiastes, this is not on the screen, but Scripture says that God has put eternity into the hearts of people. Well, if God wired you that way, then how in the world could you be emotionally healthy or physically healthy or spiritually healthy if you're not connected to God? You see, you need a way to sustain your body, and you need a way to express your emotions, but you also need a way to consistently connect with God. One of the earliest writers after biblical times, Augustine, I love this line: "I am restless until I rest in you." Even from the beginning, Augustine understood that you can do 1,000 things with your life, and you can take all the vacations that you want to take, and you can have the best friends that you want to have, and you can watch the best TV shows that you want to. You're going to be content, and God knows this about you. Now let's talk about the how for a minute. Because if you're anything like me, I have a great desire to be with God and connect with God, but I often find that there's this gap between my desire and the results that I want. And I find that a lot of people are in this place where they really want this vibrant relationship with God, and they might try a few things, but they don't get the results that they want. Let's talk about the how for just a minute. Let's read the rest of the story. When Elijah heard it, he pulled. And this would have been incredible. There in the whisper. King James Version calls it a still small voice. Modern translators say it was probably more like an eerie, holy silence. In fact, translators don't know what to do with the word. It's this profound, mysterious place where God is present, but it's not in a big and huge and demonstrative way. It's in this quiet place. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this passage is the text says that God was not in the earthquake or the wind or the fire, but you know what? That does not mean that God is never in the earthquake or the wind and the fire. In the previous story, to prove that he's God. You think about Pentecost from the New Testament, God manifests himself through the sound of wind. You think about Jesus dying on the cross, the earth shakes. So it's not that God never chooses to operate in those modes, wind, earthquake, fire. It's just that in this story, he operates in a way that's so foreign to Elijah. Elijah's expecting earthquake. He's expecting wind. He's expecting fire. And God says, no, this time I'm actually going to show up in this very gentle whisper. You see, God is going to communicate to whomever and however that he wants because he is God. And this story is amazing because it's God displaying the capacity of his ability to communicate with creation. It's incredible. I mean, you think God is in the big picture, but God's in the small picture. He can be with the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but he can be in the whisper. God can be present in the tiny flaps of a butterfly's wings, but God can also be present through a political revolution like Dr. Martin Luther King. You know, God can be in the big and he can be in the small. But here was Elijah's problem: whisper. Elijah had tunnel vision, meaning he would only see God where he chose to see God, but he would ignore God too. You see, Elijah had this great plan, and the plan was, we're going to go to too. be reestablished, and Israel and Judah are going to reign again just like they did in the glory days of King David. That was Elijah's plan. And so when that didn't happen, Elijah thought, well, God failed. God didn't fail. Elijah's plan failed. And Elijah had associated his plan with God. There's a lot of danger when you associate your plan with God. Because then if your plan fails, you assume that God fails. You ever done that? Like you were sod. But then when it doesn't happen the way you think it should happen, you assume that it's God that failed. It's not God that failed. You made the mistake that all of us make by associating our plans with God. See, in the story, God had a plan. If you read the end of this text, it's not on the screen, but God's got a plan. He's got 7,000 prophets that are, or 7,000 people that are still alive. He's going to tell Elijah, go anoint this person, go anoint that person. Like God has a plan the whole time. It's just that Elijah thought, well, God has to be in the way that I see the picture. And what happens when you get tunnel vision is you miss out on the presence of God. So for Elijah, God said, yeah, I could show up in the earthquake and the fire and the wind because I know that's what you want me to do with Ahab. But for you, Elijah, I'm going to show myself through the power of silence. If God told you that the way he would make himself known was through the discomfort of extended silence, do you think that you would take him up on the offer? So, a few months ago, I was at a staff retreat and saw this powerful video. It's all over. It went viral on the internet, so you might have seen it. But it really illustrates this idea of expanding tunnel vision to a more broad sense of being aware of the presence of God. There's a lot of videos like this, but this man has been colorblind his whole life, and they now have these glasses where you can put on these glasses and you can see color for the very first time. And it's pretty cool to watch people that have never been able to see color see color. So if you'll show this video.
Color for the colorblind. I am colorblind.
Now these are special glasses.
You're kidding.
That have been engineered that when people wear them that are colorblind, you get to see color just like we all see color.
And it came with balloons and all that.
Oh my. I can put these on.
And it'll
Just like it was supposed to be?
it'll
Like how we
correct,
all see it.
it'll correct your eyes so that you'll see how it's supposed to see.
It's so clear I can't believe it.
Dad, do you hate it?
So one moment changed the way that this guy saw all of reality. So what would it look like for you if you actually began to broaden your awareness of the ways in which God was moving in your life? My guess is some of you in the room are actually wired to see God in the really big stuff, the earthquake, the wind, and the fire. Well, in your life, what would it look like if God showed up as a whisper? But others of you are probably more wired to see God in the very small ways, through the intimate moments of quiet time with him. But what would it look like in your life if God did something huge? Would you even notice it? What would it look like for you to broaden your awareness of the presence of God? So kind of putting all this together, what exactly is this story, this amazing story in the Old Testament teaching us? Well, are you a physical being? Yeah, you're a physical being. You need sleep, you need food, you need rest, but you're more than that. You're an emotional being too. And you've got feelings, and the worst thing you can do is bottle them up, and the best thing you can do is to share that with someone you trust. But you're more than that. You're a spiritual being as well, created in the image of God to bring glory and pleasure to God, and you will be restless until you find your rest in the Lord. You're a physical being, you're an emotional being, you're a spiritual being, and the reason that you're so wonderful and complicated is because Scripture tells us, Psalm 139, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. But so are the poor. So remember that as complicated and wonderful as you are as a person, that's exactly how a poor person is. And so it doesn't do anybody any good for us to help the poor by thinking, well, money and food will solve their problems. No, they are holistic creatures. They are beings just like you and just like me. And they don't just need therapy. They don't just need someone to talk to. And they don't just need someone walking to them and saying, you know what, you're a sinful person. You just need to pray harder and everything's going to get better. No. They're holistic beings just like you, just like me. And so what this means, getting back to poverty, is that poverty alleviation must be holistic, not simplistic. We have to think through the multi-dimensional ways that these beautiful people are created in the image of God. One final thing I want to share from this story, and then we're going to sing together. I like to hike in the Wichita Mountains. I was there a few months ago. I was traveling to speak at a church in Tipton, and so I stopped off in the Wichita Mountains by myself, and I hiked up to the top of Elk Mountain, and it was really windy that day. And it's one thing to experience wind while you're just walking around on the plains. It's a different thing to experience wind when you're on the mountain. It's actually terrifying. When you're climbing around on boulders, that wind can pretty easily push you off a rock. Well, I hiked to the top, and I found this place that it was kind of a corner with a big rock slab going up and then a flat one. And I sat on this rock, and it was really profound to sit there because I could hear the wind. It was violent, but I couldn't feel it because I was protected by this big, big rock. Think about this story of Elijah. He's on the mountain, there's fire, there's earthquake, there's wind. Why doesn't he die? Like if you got caught up in a tornado or a violent earthquake or a wildfire, you might lose your life. The text doesn't even talk about him being close to death, so what protects him? If you read it carefully, he's protected by the rock. There's a rock that shields him between himself and all these elements which are hoping to bring wrath upon him. Well, what's interesting is when you go back to the Moses story in Exodus 33, very similar thing happens where God passes by Moses, and the way that Moses is protected is because God places Moses in the cleft of the rock. This is a lyric from the song that Scott just led before the sermon. God places Moses in the cleft of the rock to protect him. God places Elijah in the cleft of the rock to protect him. Did you ever realize that Moses and Elijah, even though they lived in different time periods, they do show up in Scripture at the same time? New Testament, Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah, who were on the same mountain, protected by the rock, show up on a different mountain with Jesus Christ. Have you ever thought that Jesus Christ functions spiritually as that rock? In the same way that Moses and Elijah were physically protected by this rock, by the elements, so Jesus Christ comes along. What's one of his names? Cornerstone. And Jesus then becomes this rock by which when we plant our feet firmly in relationship with him, what he does is he protects us from wrath. The most famous verse in the Bible is John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. The next verse is not as well known. God did not send his son into the world to judge the world, but to save the world. And so Jesus Christ, the reason he came into the world, and this is so important, especially for those of you that are new to faith, or you're exploring faith, or you're trying to figure out, is Jesus the person that I want to follow? Jesus Christ did not come to this world to bring judgment upon you. He came into this world to bear judgment for you. He's the rock. And he takes the wrath of God because he loves you that much. He wants you to have a relationship with God, so he comes down and he takes the brunt of it for you. And so as we keep exploring this idea of living out the mission of God. Remember, you can't be on fire for the mission of God until you're first transformed by the presence of God. And God knows you better than you know you. And if you just come to him, I promise you, he will take care of you. If you need anything from this church, if you need Jesus Christ, come while we stand and sing.